At least I didn't force you to see the whole film of hair. I thought about it, but after looking at it, there were too many hairy aspects of it that were not all that Aquarian. Which is why I think that people stopped taking seriously the idea of the age of Aquarius. But as it turns out, it's a reality and it has begun. Whether we consider it from that perspective of astrology, or we consider it as the Messianic age, or the time of the return of Christ consciousness, or the Mahdi, if you're a Muslim, or of the new Kalpa. But in any case, the change is underway. And I don't think anyone can any longer be in denial of that, even if they don't understand the fullness of the context. But the floor has fallen out from under the world's collective consciousness of what civilization was about. And a new beginning is happening, even though most people are more obsessed with the end than with the beginning. But our function is to usher in the new, not to wail the death of a civilization that altogether deserved its fate, and none too soon has that arrived to end the suffering and oppression of billions of souls, not to mention Mother Nature herself. And so we are in the most blessed moment of the whole cycle, and the most auspicious, and that moment in which everything is possible, if we are open to returning to the truth of who we are and let go of the fabrication of the ego narrative in which we have trapped ourselves. And that's the meaning of yoga. A yogi is one who liberates consciousness from its limited narratives that are filled with limited attachments and with attacks by superego voices that are always telling the ego it's not enough, unworthy, and that it is not able to receive the love of that supreme self that is one's true essence. And one has come to enjoy the ego narratives so that it is somewhat of a sacrifice to let go of one's suffering. Because let's face it, the ego is a drama queen. It loves its little melodramas. And until we are willing to abandon the obsession with who we are to the other and how the other has treated us and all of those little moments and pseudo-events which get us all angry or filled with some temporary pleasure or some envy or some remorse or whatever it is that keeps the narrative going with all of its emotional shock and awe that give the ego the illusion of having some reality. It's only when we let go of all of that that we begin to understand what reality is. And that takes a lot of maturity, psychological maturity, in which one can take control of the drives, particularly the drive to continue the narrative, and open the curtain of words that is the veil of Maya, so that the light and the love of that Supreme Presence can shine through. And we must let go not only of the very primitive and vulgar levels of the narrative at the lower chakra levels, but even of the more metaphysical narratives of growth and transformation and dealing with the obstacles of the ego. Even that is actually a game of delay and of justification for continuing a struggle with a ghost, a delusional ego that only retains its form because we indulge in our thoughts about it as if it really were some reality. And we hold on most to our traumas. The ego identifies itself with all of those ways in which karma dealt it a bad hand, and that it cannot accept, cannot forgive, cannot let go of its unique manifestations of suffering that have defined its attitudes and justify its defense mechanisms. So all of this that constitutes the complex of the ego, it is our duty to annihilate in the fire of love for God. But the ego wants to hang on to its distorted forms of limited love, which are mostly desire and attachment and possessiveness and territoriality and its sense of goodness and desirability that it comes from a certain kind of relationality in which fantasies of its being a source of support, a rescuer, a knight, a mother, a feeling of being someone who is worthy of another's love, but in which one falls into the traps of attachment that create a downward thrust of consciousness back into the child state of a collusion with another, in which that parent-child relationship may oscillate between who is playing which part, but which always maintains an imbalanced relationship in which a karmic enchainment to a particular form of identification persists in producing more events of suffering, of a missed connection, of an il-nyapa, a lack of the fulfillment of the relationship that the festering fantasies demand to be fulfilled, but which cannot be. And so all of this futility and fatality of the ego in its refusal to let go of its melodramatic figure of itself as the hero or heroine of its private drama must be surrendered in order for the real nature of our being to emerge and develop and unfold in its fullness. And because of the shift of the conditions of the world in which the old modes and systems of relationality have fallen away, there is an actual freedom of the vibrational field as we have entered into a time of unprecedented freedom from the usual, the norm, the accustomed way of looking at a future in which an identity is to be sustained. There is a freedom now to die and be reborn, to let go of an obsolete self-image and to discover who we are without preconceptions or limitations of our mind as to what is possible. And to let go of the limitations of identifying with the body means we can become non-localizable consciousness that is truly able to expand to include all as manifestations of the One Self, without any sense of difference, in which the many are all facets of the single diamond of infinite consciousness. And by seeing the one shining in the many, that oneness is able to create a field of love, of cooperation, of egoless harmony. And so the words of that song, although they were a cliche, they have still a great deal of truth, that we are entering such an age of harmony and understanding. And let's take advantage of the sublime freedom that is offered by this new condition of life that gives us the ability to create a new beginning here and now, from which we will not look back at the Kali Yuga karma that had limited the trajectory of our ascension into the supreme consciousness of which we are capable, because it is our source, it is our destiny to return and be absorbed back into that oceanic consciousness. It is the moment when all the rivers re-enter the ocean. And in this return, the sea level will rise. And because the sea level will rise, the world as it was will disappear under that flood of love, of light, of truth. And it will disappear in every way, and a new world will then arise that reflects the beauty, the joy, the love, the creativity of the mind of God. I hope everyone will take advantage of this opportunity, this God-given opportunity to be liberated from all of the past beliefs about what can happen and about who you are. So for a few days I've been cocooning again because my bosses have asked for a text about the next retreat. And so I had to ask Shiva to give that and some understanding of what would be taught in that retreat that's coming up. And so it will be about this new age that we have entered and what are its implications for our own spiritual process and for that of the world at large, and how to very practically use the understanding that has been accumulated by the great sages of all the traditions of Kali Yuga that summate in a very concise and clear step-by-step instruction as to how to transcend from ego and soul into the pure spirit of the Absolute and sustain and abide in that state until all have morphogenetically come to resonate with that one consciousness. But the ashram nivasis must first be the ones who demonstrate the reality of this transformation into our true sacred nature. And we must have the courage and the coherence to move through all of those obstacle courses of the ego that it brings in the form of enticing thoughts and emotions, and keep your eyes on the prize of supreme bliss and light and freedom. And don't look back toward what you have let go of, but remain in the emptiness that will be filled by the supreme power. And the more that we are motivated by love and by the willingness to surrender the will of the ego, the easier, the quicker, and the more beautifully this unfoldment will happen and offer the opportunity for each to be a blessing to many, many other souls who are searching for the path to liberation. So I imagine that there are some questions from the last retreat, and I think we'll use the rest of the time to try to answer those if there are any. But first I want to welcome our 3 new volunteers who have arrived. Jacob, of course, and Krista, everyone knows, but Joshua, Yeshua himself has arrived. And it's a great joy and honor to be able to welcome you to this spiritual family. And I hope all of you will feel at home and in the flow of the rising consciousness that is bringing us all back to our one source. So if there's anything you want to say, Josh, feel free.
Just like to thank everybody for welcoming me into your space. I know you guys have been pretty locked down, so I feel, really blessed to be here. And yeah, already just being here a day and a little bit, it's, I guess I've created a very powerful field here that I already feel my heart is very expanded, and so thank you all very much. And I look forward to rising in consciousness with everybody. And I appreciate Jacob for talking so kindly of me and putting in a good word for me over the last couple of years that allowed me to get my feet into the door. So thank you, Shunya, and everybody.
Okay, thank you. All right, so the floor is open. And if anyone wishes to ask a question or make a comment or anything else that you wish to contribute, feel free. Mm-hmm. Oh, we're doing the mic thing, huh? Okay.
Thank you for a most inspiring and beautiful message of renewal, rebirth. I think it's very inspiring and very, uplifting.
Mm.
So, I grew up with this song, The Age of Aquarius, and I sang it at the time, in groups, and it was like the song of the time, right? And I always wondered what exactly the Age of Aquarius meant, and there are so many versions of, whether it's astrological or, this love and peace movement. It was kind of one of the hymns, right, of at least I remember in the late 60s, early 70s. That was what represented, at least for my generation, the love and peace, or one of the songs that represented. But I would love to hear your perspective of the meaning of the Age of Aquarius, and why have you chosen precisely this song tonight to talk about this new chapter and this new opening and this new sun to shine in a way, which is what I take as your message today. And what does it mean for us, for the world, for Sangha, etc.?
Okay. I'm not an astrologer. I can't say too much about it, but I can say a little bit. So usually you'll see it written like that. Sometimes it'll end downward, but sometimes it'll be an upward movement, and sometimes it'll be one side will be up and the other down. But to me, they are representing two waveforms that are becoming synchronized, two vibrational frequencies. One of the samsara and one of the nirvana, but they're becoming now connected and unified. So we are reaching a point in which the current of Shakti is going to flow very strongly in a very unified electrical way that is going to bring about very powerful changes very rapidly. Aquarius is not a water sign, even though it has that word, Aquarius, and you see usually a young lad pouring the water down. Well, that actually represents both a connection between the higher and the phenomenal, but it is also a sign of the floods that are going to be poured onto the world and to bring an end to the previous age. That age, the Piscean age, was in the water, but it was a water of unconsciousness and duality. And now we move to a vibrational frequency that is electrical and that is within the air, within the atmosphere, within the mind, the consciousness. It's not any longer in the subconsciousness. So it is the notion of a rising consciousness that brings a new beginning. And if you trace back the astrological sign into ancient Greece, there's a myth that goes along with the Aquarian age. And that myth is about a new server who is being hired by Zeus to assist in the reorganization of the Olympian gods, actually. And his name, who gets chosen as being the most beautiful human who can work with the gods, his name is Ganymede. Now, if you, and Ganymede is this very beautiful human consciousness who is raised into God consciousness. But because his beauty disturbs the old, let's say, configurations of the gods, who all have to now deal with a new being who is both human and God, very Christ-like figure. They don't know how to deal with him. And Zeus's wife Hera gets kind of upset that he is here and he is creating a kind of a new context and a new configuration of the divine hierarchy. And so the gods get together and say, well, you know, this Ganymede is a little much for us. And they do something very strange, and as far as I know, unique in Greek mythology. They decide to send Ganymede into outer space. Yeah, not into, you know, Hades or into some other, you know, Greek usual kind of underworld or something, but literally into outer space to make connection with space beings. Well, okay, you can take that in whatever level and way you wish, but I find that to be a rather extraordinary myth to exist. Furthermore, if you look at the name, the Gan comes directly from Ganesh. And the mead, of course, mead from Persian, the Persian Zoroastrian and Vedic cultural roots of the Greek culture, but mead is also the middle, the center. So we have the new beginning coming from the very center of consciousness, from the supreme consciousness that is going to move in very beautiful ways that bring Christ consciousness or that union of the human and the supreme divinity into a form that is going to extend into outer space and bring a connection between those beings from beyond the earth plane into a unified field of a cosmopolitan consciousness. So that's my take on the age of Aquarius. Anyone else?
You just mentioned electricity, and I think, you just mentioned electricity, and during the retreat, during the Nandamayi teaching that we just recently saw again, you made a distinction, I think, between magnetism, and I wrote down magnetism is love, and then electricity is the shock that was given. What's the difference between those, and what are the implications of that?
Well, the electrical force is that which extends outward, and it can shock, but it can also create a current of energy. When we want Shaktipat, we want the electrical energy to fill us, and it becomes prana, the life energy of the body, but also it becomes the light of the mind. So we want the electrical energy, but we want it to come in a way that is connected to our own consciousness and that is able to be used rather than a situation where there's a short circuit that's created, as was the case with Anandamayi Ma in this case, because there was an unwanted connection that then the electricity went out as a shock and a repulsive or repelling kind of energy, which you see in electrical fences and electrical cattle prods and those kinds of things. So electricity can be used both to keep someone away from a field that is full of live current, but it is also the current that can be used to run body forms or technology, etc. So it is that basic energy that it underlies everything, even though from the level of the Brahman, electromagnetism is already a stepped down version of the scalar force, etc. But the magnetic is that which draws in, right? So magnetism is more about love, whereas the electrical is more about a power that can create a field, which can be protective and can also be an energy that can be disseminated for whatever uses are required. But the magnetic draws into the heart. And so when someone is of Anandamayi Ma's caliber of being, her magnetic energy draws people in to love her. She's irresistible in the radiance of her being that is the electrical, but the magnetic draws one to want to be within that field. And if the connection is one of lust, not of lust, but of love, that is a divine recognition, then the magnetism flows. If there's a lustful energy, then it becomes the electrical repulsion. So she is capable of modulating the conditions of the field depending on the attitude of someone who was approaching her. Okay, does that help? Okay. No other questions? Okay, well that's good. Then we can keep going, you know. We don't have to talk about the retreat. I think the retreat now, as I look back, was too simple. And we have to go to a much more advanced level now. Nirgun, did you want to say something?
Okay, I'll ask a question. Thank you. You spoke in the teaching a little bit about being focused on the new beginning rather than the death or the end. And I definitely feeling this updraft and the wave that's lifting me, lifting us, lifting consciousness. And I wonder what what does one do, or how, right? But that's a kind of a ridiculous question. How does one open more, surrender to, and act with Wu Wei? Like, do you understand what I'm...
You see, the problem is that question comes out of the illusion that you're a someone who has to do a something, right? That's what has to be let go of. So what is called for is a non-doing, a recognition that you're not a doer, and you're not that body or that thinking apparatus that wants to figure things out and wants to be productive and make things happen. No, things are happening by the will of that Supreme Being, and all we have to do is be the empty vessels that are then filled and moved by that power. And that requires not only a non-doing, but a literal non-existence as a separate entity. And the illusion of that separate entity is created by thoughts. Therefore, what needs to happen is the silencing of the thoughts. But that's not a doing, that's a not doing and a not thinking. But in attending to that center of consciousness, out of which new kinds of inspirations, new kinds of thoughts that come from that higher level will emerge. And so, in a way, your marching orders will come, but they will come out of the stillness of a presence within that has the wisdom to move you in a particular direction at a particular moment. But by being silently aware and attending to that source of your being that will, at the right moment, inspire or create an impulse to action, It will be spontaneous without the intermediary of an ego saying, that's a good idea, I wonder if I should do that. No, it'll be a spontaneous movement of the body-mind, but you won't be identified with it. And the more you stay disidentified from it, the more the flow of the continual wisdom and presence of mind and empowerment will continue to sustain the activity of the body-mind. But it will be completely an egoless surrender to that source that will move the form into whatever ways that are required. Okay? So we just have to get out of the way. That's all that's really necessary. I hope that's useful. Okay. Kalki.
How do you call that god? The name?
Ganymede?
Yeah. I was just wondering, I love when you tell stories, like mythological stories. Why was exactly that the other gods didn't like him?
I think they were jealous of him.
Okay.
And of Zeus's preference for him over some of the other goddesses and gods. So I think it was more that they were disturbed by, the new guy on the block. So as humans rise into divine consciousness again, it disturbs the archons a bit, who have been running the show in Kali Yuga, and they have to move out of the way. And especially when you reach that point where you connect in outer space with inner space, that will change what happens within the local space of the planet.
It's also interesting that a god was going to make a contact with aliens, right? It's a god with aliens. Mm-hmm. So it's more like, what was the trait they were going to do?
Mm-hmm. Well, he's actually human. Remember that. Ganymede is a human who is raised up to Olympus. So he is able then to relate to these beings in that intermediary state that's between humanoid, if you will, and divine, that is able to function, let's say, at the archetypal level of consciousness, okay? Because that's all that the extraterrestrial really means. It's an archetypal angelic force that has been materialized. But it is made of the archetypal information of that plane. So as we live on the archetypal level, as beings who are angelic emissaries of the Supreme, then we can relate on an equal playing field, if you will, an equal level, regardless of body forms and how mental operations take place, because we're now beyond the limited mind into the archetypal mind that all beings share.
It's more dimensional than physical, like physical in the sense that spaceship come and one say hi or something like that. It's more, it can be more abductional, let's say, like you were speaking.
It can be, but it can be many different ways.
Okay, thank you.
Trey?
Thank you, Shunya. I was just curious if you had any further suggestions on how, your recommendation to Nirgun was go into the quiet mind again and to allow what spontaneously comes up to come up and respond from there with non-attachment, right, and surrender. But how do you decipher between the ego thoughts come up sometimes spontaneously that I'm not really identified with. So it's like...
You'll know the difference between a thought that is an ego thought, because usually they're repetitive, you know what the ego wants, it's usually very mundane, or it's based on some fantasy that the ego has had. But if a thought comes from down, from the higher level, it will be something that is either shattering or awesome or sublime or will shockingly have a new level of coherence that you didn't have before. So the difference between the superconscious and the conscious or subconscious aspects of the ego is very different, and will lead to a very different kind of action or an unfoldment of thought processes that emerge in the course of the understanding of that inspiration that you receive.
And I saw you doing this a lot, right? Would you say that it would be like an expansiveness in your heart, a feeling that you just know, like that it's not a knowing in your mind as much as it's a knowing in your heart, that this is coming from a different place?
It's an integration of the two. Because yes, you'll feel it in your heart because it'll be a thought that is heart opening and beautiful and filled with love and joy. But it will also be of a very powerful intellectual nature that will be very explanatory as well. So it'll have both aspects. It's not one or the other.
Mm-hmm. And so if there's any thought that's questioning, was this from something higher, then it probably wasn't, right? Like, is it something that you would know right
Yeah, you'll
away?
know. When there's no doubt, then I would pay attention to it. Other than that, I would go back into the silence until it comes. And it'll be like a lightning bolt or like such an aha that there won't be any question. Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Josie.
Thank you. Lately, I've been feeling kind of interesting. I remember you always say that as you move forward, you have even more anxiety because your ego gets more and more scared. And first, I thought that was what was happening to me, and then I realized, it's not really anxiety that I'm feeling, but I think it's mourning.
Mourning. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
For what? The old life?
Mourning the sensory world and the attachments, mourning my attachment to the suffering and the pain, and mourning the drama queen, and maybe even mourning the fact that I don't really miss that much. And that's hard for the ego to hear and feel. And to start off this teaching today, you talked about the importance of our purpose is to enter what's coming, not to dwell on the past that we're leaving behind. So I guess I'm wondering how can everyone mourn healthfully and not be nostalgic, and how can we, properly sit with what we're losing, but remain happy? Like, I seem to feel a little bit of both, and I'm wondering how to keep growing from it.
Sure. So it's not really a mourning, because mourning happens after the death of the ego. And the ego is what's doing the mourning. So what it is grieving is its future, its destiny. It knows it's going to die because it's an obsolete form of consciousness that doesn't serve you. It's not really valid. It's not really, as you just said, you don't really want it. You don't really miss any of the past. But there's still an attachment to that identity. So the mourning is its last way of holding on to prolong its agony and not just die, because once the ego's gone, there's no mourning left. Now it's a new morning, but it's just pure light and love and joy. There's no longer any sadness. So this grief is the ego's last stand. And it's another melodrama. It's another way to be the drama queen of, I'm mourning all of that, right? And it makes a nice narrative out of it and extends it, and you can write a whole novel about that, right? So what you want to do is stop that process, because there's really nothing to be sad about. Why grieve the loss of something that was just suffering and delusion? So the cure is silence of the mind until all traces of interest in grief or in any of the old egoic thought patterns has been completely put to rest. All right, and then very powerful new kinds of information and energies will come into the space that is now free of those kinds of grieving thoughts and feelings that will bring you to a much higher state of consciousness, and the old ego will have no space, and you'll have no interest in returning to it, and the consciousness will just continue to expand and to enter levels of insight that are so subtle and so pure and so clear that the nature of reality that begins to become visible to you it will reveal the presence of God in every moment, which will be so amazing that there won't be any room for any other kind of thought. Okay. Nectar drop.
So there's been some deep feelings of feeling left out in a way, and I can't describe it in a sense of like I can't put words to it, but I feel like there's something, it comes from a very deep place, and I'm wondering, well, it seems like it's a universal trauma, an egoic trauma, and also like how to unlock it when it comes up, because it feels like it's not placed in the right place.
Mm-hmm. Your ego was invented out of the thought that you were being left out. So that thought is the core of the ego's identity. It felt originally it was left out of mommy's love and left out of daddy's and left out of the family system. It was outcasted and black sheeped and treated in a scapegoating kind of way, which did happen. But that became so encrusted that thought became the dominant mode of feeling, not just thinking, that the ego has been like stuck in as like a mold. And you have to break free of it and pull that apart, because you are chosen. You are not left out. Quite the opposite. You are right in the center of the uplifting of consciousness for the world. So there should be great joy that you have been the one out of your biological family. I don't see the others here, right? Who's left out, you know? So you are the chosen one, and you're rising in consciousness when everyone else is collapsing. So you should be celebrating, but you have to really undo that whole ego construct and not buy into it anymore, because it was reality in the past, but it's now just a fantasy residue of something that had already ended. But if you keep on feeling that way, then you will produce, through projection, new ways of feeling left out, but they're not real. They're provoked and projected and bought into out of the homeostatic desire of the ego to feel at home. But feeling at home means feeling left out. So it's a discomfort zone that the ego can't get out of until you realize that you are the unborn self who now is being left out of suffering and admitted into the bliss of the eternal presence that never changes, just like Anandamaya Ma. Always the same, always blissful. And that's who you really are. Okay, so let go of the illusion. When it comes up, recognize it's just simply a residue of the past that has no reality. Okay? Josh.
Thank you. So during the retreat, you had brought up and I had asked this question via the live stream about the tamasic versus sattvic. And sometimes I feel like in the emptiness of the mind and the absence of thoughts, like a dumbness or something, or I judge it as dumb because I don't have whether it's an interaction with people, like nothing arises sometimes. And you had mentioned in like a tamasic state, and I believe you mentioned like an unhealthy detachment or something. Do you recall?
Mm-hmm.
So how does one know the difference between like dumbness and also like progressing, you know, and like?
Well, if you really are in the silence of a mind that has transcended the conceptual thought level, then that thought that I'm dumb will not appear, right, either. So that thought is the ego's way of pulling you back into a tamasic state, because it wants you to believe that you don't have intelligence, right? So it's a delusional thought, and you can't allow it to pull you down. But when you stay in the silence long enough, what you discover is that there is a tamasic version, which is you're falling asleep or spacing out or losing consciousness. But there's another level in which there's an alert presence, and in which time slows down and you become very aware of very subtle aspects of reality. And although you're not thinking, there's a knowing that is there. And you can have an intuitive knowledge of what's going on, what are the energies that are present, what needs to happen, what to avoid, how to move through the space if your body is in action. It will all happen, but it'll happen in silent presence in which time slows down to such a state that you'll actually be ahead of most of the other people who are thinking, and therefore in a much different linear time frame, whereas you're already able to take leaps into time spaces that others haven't reached yet. Because you will be able to know the thoughts that haven't yet arisen in their minds but will, and the actions that may happen. This is the secret of martial arts, where you want to get so silent and so present that you know what your opponent is going to do before they do it, and you're already ready to take the counter move, right? So you're a step ahead, and you're able to dominate the movement of the situation with an energy that is able to be centered and bring a kind of peaceful resolution to whatever is going on. So there will be great intelligence, but because you don't need to think, you're much quicker in knowing, and it becomes instantaneous. So focus on that and don't allow the thought of dumbness to appear. And then you'll see the intelligence will show up just like that, and it'll be very sparkling and very accurate.
Thank you.
Okay. Ashoka.
In your latest morning teaching, you mentioned that if you like once you know about God, you can love God in the wrong way, so it's worse than not knowing God at all. So in response to that, like, how do we love God in the right way?
This is a very deep question, and a whole book could be written about, and it's really what the next retreat is about also. First of all, one must love God with humility and with a recognition that the one loving God is the finite level of the mind loving the infinite, right? So you want to be able to open up so completely that you can receive that infinite nature within your consciousness. But it will shatter the ego because it can't hold the infinite. So what happens is, through the surrender, your love absorbs you into the beloved. And it's when that love has become union and there's no difference, that's when the presence of that love itself, that is no longer either lover or beloved, those two polarities have disappeared into the field. and the love, which is also wisdom, which is also truth and power and will, all of that is contained within the love, begins to be the energy that you are. And there's no longer any thinking about God or any thinking about your ego or about the world. There's just a presence that sees and that creates through the vision that will come through. Because the world is a projection and is a reflection of consciousness, the more you are in that source of consciousness, the more that what you will see is the dream potentialities that will emerge. And because you're able to see the highest potential in every being that you relate to, that potential suddenly emerges in that being just because you see it. And so the God seed is placed everywhere you look, and it sprouts almost instantaneously just by your vision watering it with that Aquarian electricity that brings it into its ultimate revelation of itself. Vajra.
Thank you. That was such a beautiful answer. Thanks, Ashoka, for asking that question. Maybe related. I had a question. You said the other day that the higher vibrational frequencies are outside of the body.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could explain where that transition is, or what that's like, or how it's related to what's experienced in the body.
It's not outside the body in space. It's outside the body as a construct of consciousness. It's a dimensional shift. Because in reality, there is no body. Bodies are an illusion of a dense mode of consciousness. There is only light, and the light takes different forms. Just like if you see a film, it's just light projected on a screen. But you'll differentiate with your mind the bodies of different actors, right, in the film. But all you see is light, and they are all the same light going through the filter of a film. And that film is Maya, or the consciousness of the ego that creates the illusion of a body and puts itself into that body. But the consciousness is actually the light that's projecting the whole world as the film in which you are now an actress and performing a part. But once you have entered into that higher energy that's outside of the hologram, dimensionally outside of space as well as outside of time, then you're able to direct those energies into the hologram in order to explode its paradigm and enable the light to shine both into and throughout the field of consciousness, and enable a new dream, a new film, a new reality to emerge that purely reflects the divine intelligence and beauty and love and joy that you are into the world that creates a new age, a new heaven on earth, because of the explosive bliss that you bring into the field. Marjivama.
So when we're listening to the song in meditation, it was the vibrations or the thought that came up was gaiety, God's gaiety.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a word I often think about or comes up, but there was just this sense of in the midst of the collapse, of a movie like Hair, at best, there's the gaiety of that magnetic force that was uplifting And it came to me just a little bit now that is it not perhaps also what I'm recognizing, which really was, the thought really popped, that it was my own recognition that in moments in which, things may be getting hairy, and it's right there at the cusp, and there's that choice that kind of one has to make. Yeah,
whether to go into ego or stay
exactly
in
that. That I think this is what I was perceiving in the song, is that there is this upshot of the gaiety that is becoming ever more the winning side, let's say, of the dice, really. Which way will you roll them?
Yeah, that's right.
And so the this changing of the times between suffering and gaiety, right, is perhaps what I was reflecting back to the song. And the song was reflecting, by reverberating back, almost as a, well, I don't know if it's almost, but it seems that it is that unified intelligence that was very much playing out something I needed to understand, not just feel it, but as you were speaking about the mind and the heart uniting. And so I'm this is the understanding I'm now perceiving, is that it was a moment in which a lesson was being given, and I needed to extract from it what it was. That perhaps will this now perhaps give the added power to not even get into that cutting edge of hairy situations.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the gaiety is the realization that the world is designed as a comedy. Shiva has a strange sense of humor, but it is humorous, all of it. And the more that you're aware of that and can laugh with everything that's happening rather than get upset, the more that you win, because then you're rolling sevens, right? And chakra 7 is always filled with joy and bliss. So you'll be able to stay on that side of things. And if you can handle every hairy situation with joy and humor and seeing the beauty of it and the blessing hidden within it, then everything will unfold perfectly. And so that is indeed the victory, the Jayadev, is being able to do exactly that. So you're right on the line to move to that beautiful joy that never ends. Thank you. Okay, well, I think this has to end because we're over time, but I appreciate everyone's questions and comments, and the fact that you are all working. I can feel so hard, so diligently to break through the ego's melodramas and attempts to hold you in a fixed identity that is obsolete, and that you're not going to settle for that. So it's a very victorious Sangha that we have here, and you've all been chosen because of your power to see through the illusions and to have the courage to not know who you are in order to discover who you really are. And you have to go through that emptiness, past the grief of the death of the ego, into the complete unknownness, because God is the ultimate mystery. And the ego can never know God. You can never know your real self. And it's only when you have given up the attempt of the ego to appropriate the self, which is just the narcissistic attempt to have master's discourse. But the moment you are really free of that and you can surrender, then that self and you become one again. But it is a requirement to enter into the absolute unknowability and unattainability of that ultimate mystery until not knowing it, but being it, emerges as the truth of what you are. And then from that beingness, the knowing can emerge in a way of creative expression that will be able to capture part of the mystery, but never the whole of it. And it is the fact that you are unknowable and unreachable, which is the meaning of salvation, because it means no suffering can touch you. No projection of anyone else can reach you and hurt you. No event that can happen on the phenomenal plane has any reality in relation to your supreme beingness. And by realizing that, it's total solitude and beyondness, transcendence, and yet it's that transcendent freedom and immunity to harm that creates the fearless capacity to be in the world again, but not of it, and fearlessly speaking the truth, living it, and sharing the beauty of the love of that beingness that does not require defenses and can live with pure goodness without aggressivity. And that's the change of the age that's being manifested through our surrender to the real. Thank you all. Namaste.